tough questions discussion / interview / podcast kind of thing that we're doing. The whole premise of it is, once again, just to say it's the questions we've discussed in our groups at the pub about some of the really tough questions Christians and even non-Christians have to deal with, and we talk with experts, people who have those opinions, or even people who've had experiences with those situations to try and go a little deeper into the topic. And at the moment we are very, very privileged to be with Kirsi Cobb, a lecturer at Cliff College, who's going to be talking to us about women and the Bible. So Kirsi, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, as you said, my name is Kirsi Cobb. I did my PhD in women's studies and how the Bible can be interpreted in various ways. And I have been working here at Cliff for the last about 5 years, and Women in the Bible is one of the major courses I now teach here.
A very popular course.
It is quite a popular course, yes, and what is funny kind of about it is that when I first taught it, everybody who took the course, they were all female, but the longer the course has been running, the ratio has gone on its head. So
really?
Now it's actually more guys that are taking the course than the girls, so which is entertaining.
Yeah, because you and I have talked previously on some stuff like this as well, haven't we? On
we have.
Things like women in leadership and concept all this. It's interesting to see, actually, because you are an absolute expert on things like Old Testament, New Testament, contexts of the time. I remember being absolutely amazed in our lectures of the context you could offer to every biblical story, which would offer so much more insight.
Oh, we can only try.
Yeah. Well, you're a perfect person for this idea. We will be talking about women in the Bible. We'll also be looking at the idea of women in leadership, because of course it's been a very hot topic in the church over history.
Oh yes.
And so it's going to be a thing. I mean, if we start with perhaps one of the more basic kind of questions, I mean, the thing that always got me when I was starting reading the Bible is how much more men seem to be referred to. I mean, even we look at the idea of the names of books.
Yeah.
You know, it's very rare you get I mean, you've got like Esther and Ruth.
Yeah.
But other than that, really, it all seems to be very much male dominated. I mean, why is that, do you think?
There are a couple of reasons that could be given to that. I think one of the main ones is that the kind of times that the Bible describes and the kind of times when the Bible was written, they were all kind of, and still are to some extent, male-dominated times. So a lot of the time, women's involvement would have been seen as part of like mystery cults or something that you shouldn't be involved in. So it looks like from that point of view that a lot of the Bible is spoken through men, kind of in order to basically to get the message across. And there is also the fact that purely from a cultural point of view, when we go back, we don't even have to go back that long, 50 years, and we basically find that women couldn't be doing the kinds of things that, say, men do in the Bible. They couldn't be theologians, they couldn't be leaders. Not that long ago, we couldn't even vote. So, so I think what we have in the Bible is God trying to get his message across through faulty human beings and through faulty human systems, and that this one went, which is then for me lovely when we do get women in the Bible, because they are often there to break the norm.
Very countercultural.
Yes, they are there to kind of show that this is not how it always has to be. And even the story of Eve and Adam before the fall, in my view, is a very mutual, it's a very kind of a story which is kind of mutual in the relationship. There is no kind of power struggles or anything until when the fall takes place. And I think that is then also a theological reason for that, is that we are part of fallen humanity, where, like it says in Genesis 3:16, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And within that we get this idea that men will want to have the upper hand, and women, depending how you read that verse, will either be wanting to have children or protection or fight against this rulership of their husbands or whatever. But we live in this fallen state where that's just how it is, sadly.
So the idea being that because women were associated, there's such a stigma really around women then, that you think God would have challenged more through men because the message needed to get out. And it just wasn't
yes.
with women.
Yeah, and we get that even in, I mean, I know that I do most of the Old Testament, but we even do this, see this with Jesus, because, well, Jesus, I think, for all intents and purposes, had to be male, for the very reason that if a woman would have turned up, we probably would have got, which we still get today, this kind of, oh, they are here for some feminist cause, we are not going to listen to you. And kind of female rabbis were almost unheard of. And so what we get with that then is that Jesus turns up here on planet Earth as a man, but his treatment of women is completely countercultural.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is one of those kind of, I think God saved Christianity from becoming some sort of a women burning their bras movement, basically. And just try to get the message across, but include in that actually this is not how it's supposed to be. There's a role for both genders in here.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Genesis there, this idea of this perfect utopian time in the Garden of Eden between Eve and Adam and Eve. And I remember actually being taught this actually in lectures, and this wasn't on my notes actually. I'd love to talk a little about that actually, because of course for a lot of church history you see this idea that actually Eve was the one who caused the issue. Eve was the one who ate the fruit. Eve was the one who got us to this point. No doubt you can hear now on our audio the flicking of the Bible, as I'm sure I'm about to be absolutely roasted on this. But I mean, in church history you hear about it a lot, this idea of you can see woman as being the original issue. But I remember you gave a fantastic defense of that.
Did I now? Let's hope I can remember it. I was actually just teaching Eve last week to our Women in the Bible lecture, so let's see if I can still remember this. But basically when we have a look at the so-called fall narrative, and I say so-called because in the Jewish faith it is not called that, so hence it's a kind of a Christian title. But what happens here is that originally, when both men and women, or Adam and Eve, were created, as I said, the story seems to read very much that she is meant to be, well, as the verse says, verse 18:18 says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." The word for helper is a Hebrew word ezer, which in its verb form, asa, to help, often refers to God helping Israel. It can be other people helping other people, yes, but a lot of the time it is God actually helping Israel. And what God is doing here is that he's creating someone who can quite literally help Adam. And the fact that she's going to be a companion suitable for him, it's another lovely Hebrew phrase, which in the building of the temple and the tabernacle refers to the opposite of the wall. That we have a wall here, then we've got an opposite wall there. They are both walls, they are both keep the building up, it's just on the other side. So she's literally a perfect match. So she's not his little helper or something like this, go and do the dishes. That is not the point here whatsoever.
So even in the first description almost of the making of woman, she's almost elevates the idea of God. You'll be a helper in the same way as God is described as helping humanity.
Oh yes, yeah, because one of the rabbis actually thought this idea that it might be that why the creation of Eve is left till very late in the story is so that the man would realize he needs her. He cannot do what he does in Genesis 3 later, say, well, it's this woman you gave me. Well, technically, you were alone and miserable. And that is why I created a helper for you. So it's this idea of we're kind of leaving the best till last type idea here. And it is then interesting when we get to Genesis 3. I could spend the whole 45 minutes talking about this, but I shall try to put this briefly. First of all, when we get this story right at the start, when the serpent turns up, and in verse in 3:1, it says about the serpent that he said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" And that actually is a really intelligent question. This serpent is not stupid, because that you in verse 1 is a plural you, as in more than one person. But when God originally gave the command, it was you singular. You, Adam, you are not supposed to eat from any tree.
So Eve wasn't there when it was actually said.
Yes, Eve wasn't actually there. So now, when the snake then slithers in and comes and asks Eve, well, did God really say that you? He's actually asking, does this command include you as well? Or is it just this lovely husband of yours? Maybe you are allowed to eat, but maybe he isn't. And so she then enters into this conversation with the serpent that shows that she has some knowledge of the command. Not a perfect recollection, but some sort of a knowledge of the command. But then the serpent goes further and basically says half-truths. He will, oh no, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. Yes, you will know good and evil, and by the way, you'll end up dead. But he kind of uses all these sort of half-truths, which is actually the perfect kind of expression of how the devil often deals with us. It is not Kirsi Cobb rob a bank. It's you don't really like your husband, do you? He forgot to buy the milk. It's kind of a half truth that is kind of shoved in your face. And another thing that is interesting about this is that while the snake is having the chat with Eve, it says here right at the end of verse 6, she also gave some to her husband who was with her. So Adam is there. He hasn't gone to the pub like one of my students said. He has not gone to the pub. He has been there along with her, listening to this conversation and said nothing.
So even though Eve wouldn't have been there when God gave the command and said, don't eat of that fruit, Adam was there.
Adam
was next to Eve when the temptation was there and said nothing. In fact, somebody slightly mischievous scholar said that what might have happened, he thinks, oh, well, maybe, okay, let's give this a go. That Adam was like standing beside her, waiting to see would she fall down dead if she eats of the fruit, and when she doesn't, he's like, oh, okay then. But she might have a tester.
She's a test subject. Now that is being a bit mean to Adam here, so maybe we'll just delete that out of the recording. But that seems to be the idea here, is that they are together and they fall together. Eve's sin is in the fact that she seems to believe the serpent. She falls for the lies. Adam's sin is in the fact that he does nothing. He doesn't intervene. He says absolutely nothing. He doesn't even say to Eve, this is a bad idea. He does nothing. So what we then get is that once they both have eaten, does everything then go sideways. Once they both have eaten, everything then goes wrong. And which and then is interestingly is talked about, Paul talks about this later in Romans, where he is basically saying about Adam and how Adam fell, that in fact the blame is actually put more on Adam than is actually ever put on Eve, and that seems to just illustrate the fact that these people, they fell together.
Yeah.
They did it together, they fell together. So all of this kind of interpretation, that goes way back centuries. It is not a new invention. Way back centuries, this interpretation, oh, woman has feeble intellect. She should not have known better than take the authority of her husband and eat the fruit. He was there!
He was there and did nothing.
He was there and did absolutely nothing. So they seem to do everything together, and they also fall together.
Well, so, I mean, if we look at the result of that fall, then
yes.
we get this idea of woman and man fell together. Adam was there. It's an equal fault on both parts. But you get to then, Genesis 3, verse 16, and it says, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.
Yes.
Is this not God putting something in place?
No, that is the big debate here. Some people have read that to mean that this is what God is commanding Adam and Eve to do. So he's basically saying, okay, Eve, you better have a desire for your husband, and Adam, you better rule over her because she's dumb. But the thing is that the Hebrew grammar does not support that reading at all, because the tense that is used here, it's I think the closest equivalent to English that we would get is that it's more of a futuristic tense. It's more saying this is going to happen.
It's a kind of prophecy. This is what's going to happen to women.
It is not a case of he's commanding anyone. That form is not used here. The form that is used here is kind of, well, you did this, so this is going to happen now. And when it says about this, your desire will be for your husband, it could be interpreted a couple of ways. The desire could be a desire to rule. It's used in that way later in Genesis 4. So it could be that the woman wants the upper hand and the man will want the upper hand, and they will just fight till eternity, but the man will have the upper hand. But it could also then just be a case of, well, the woman will desire her husband. She desires the security. She wants to be with him. She wants to have children or whatever. And this battle will just keep on going, where woman, instead of turning to God, will turn to the man. And man, instead of turning to God, will want to rule. So it is kind of, sadly, even nowadays, a state of affairs a lot of the time that we are just in this cycle of people either trying to rule or trying to look for something that another person can't provide necessarily, because after all, your husband cannot be everything to you yet. That's what sometimes women do want. So we end up in this sad state of affairs where things have kind of gone wrong, yet I would say that that's exactly what Jesus comes to fix.
Right.
Because then in Galatians 3, Paul says, well, in Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. So it seems that Jesus' sacrifice is not there just to restore the Israelites to God or the Gentiles to God or make peace between free and slave, but it is there to restore this gulf that we caused right at the start of Genesis.
It's to set things back to an equal footing.
Yeah, it is there to start a process of redemption, to bring things back to kind of as they were in Genesis. And it is interesting elsewhere in the Bible, New Jerusalem is kind of this God's coming kingdom in the future when Jesus comes back, is sometimes described as being this perfect Eden yet again, that this New Jerusalem is like this new creation, quite literally. So it seems that is what Jesus then came to start.
So it's interesting. I mean, we get. I mean, a lot of history has gone from this opening few passages of Genesis about how we must now rule over women. We must have now this.
Yes.
And yet, despite this, we mentioned about how you've got the Book of Esther, the Book of Ruth, these books named after women. I mean, the Israelite tribe, which were God's chosen people, were very different to the tribes around them at the time, with their acceptance of people like that, their equal living, and it is very countercultural at the time. I don't think people realise how countercultural it is to have women mentioned in the Bible in that way.
Oh yes, oh yes. I mean, I was teaching a class on 1 Corinthians just recently, and even the fact that Paul in one of his letters even just mentions women as co-workers is like, whoa, no. That is not what you do. I mean, some rabbis even taught that you shouldn't even speak to a woman walking down the street, and here is Paul celebrating women that are working with him. Now, come Paul's time, some of these rules, mainly due to Roman influence, were a lot more relaxed. But even so, the celebration of women doing the same work that he is doing and sacrificing their lives as he's sacrificing them is remarkable.
So we almost need to try and look at the Bible in the context of its time. Sometimes we dilute the idea of how important it is to have mentioned women in the Old Testament, for the fact that Jesus mentions them, the fact that women were the first people to see the risen Christ.
Yes.
A very countercultural thing at the time.
Oh, very.
And even Paul's mentioning of women.
Oh, yes. And I love that story about Jesus appearing to Mary and then sending her off and appearing to the women in general, because in Jewish society, women's testimony wasn't really deemed that reliable. So the fact that Jesus actually chooses to appear to women who then go off and tell the guys what's going on is like ridiculously countercultural, because he deliberately chooses those who would not naturally be believed.
And you see that in the disciples. They don't believe the women at first. They say, no, we need to go see this for ourselves.
Yes, oh yes, and that might have been just pure disbelief, or it could have been, oh well, it's the silly girls talking to us. Oh dear! That's the fire alarm. Yeah, for those who are wondering what that massive shriek was that signalled the second coming, no, this is Cliff College. There's a fire alarm I completely forgot about. A testing of it every Friday. We'll live. That'll be in there. So yeah, there's a very countercultural thing at the time then with Jesus, with the Old Testament, things like that. It's massive. I mean, but naturally, I mean, we mentioned some of those things that Paul says later in the Bible, which are very difficult to wrap your head around. Yes. I mean, if we go to one of them just now, just 1 Corinthians 14:34. Oh yes. I mean, those who are listening, maybe following this, if they've got a Bible in front of them and want to join in with this, coming to 1 Corinthians 14:34. Oh, here we go. Where are we? Kirsi's far more knowledge. I found it. Let your women keep silent in the churches. For they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. I mean, what if this is an equality kind of thing? If the Christian church, I mean, Paul is the person who really found the early church. Yeah. I mean, so why would he be talking like this? Well, context is everything. When I was teaching kind of how to interpret the Bible, there are 3 ground rules, 3 rules you should always follow, and they are context, and context. Which is basically is the case here as well, because what has been going on just earlier is that right in verse 29, Paul is talking about prophets who are speaking in the church, and he's trying to give order to how the Corinthians are conducting their worship services, because the Corinthians are all over the place. From what we understand from this letter is that they are speaking in tongues, having little monologues for a couple of hours long or whatever. They are prophesying all over each other and heaven knows what. And Paul is like saying, oh, for Pete's sake, let's put some order in place. And what he says in verse 29 In my version, it says 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn. You can all prophesy in turn. Just don't do it on top of each other. So that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets. For God is not the God of disorder, but of peace. So what we get here is Paul is organizing how the prophets should be behaving, how they should be prophesying, who should be taking a turn and all the rest. And it is after that he all of a sudden goes into saying, as in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches, where they are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. Now, the thing is that if we read that out of context, it sounds like women shut up for the rest of your lives if you know what's good for you. But actually, read in context, it seems to be that the context of this is in fact the use of the prophetic spiritual gifts.
Right.
And what may have taken place, and this is all kind of a partly guesswork, because that is the nature of letters. The receiver will know stuff automatically, it doesn't need to be said. The problem is with us, hundreds of years later, reading this and not knowing that, so we have to kind of guess some of this of what's going on. But one of the, shall we say, slightly more educated guesses, what's going on here is that women, probably married women, they have been coming to church, and they would have been less educated than the men, because they would have had their schooling, they would be in trade, whatever. And the women are a bit, what's going on? What did you just say? Because this verse continues, must be in submission, as the law says, verse 35, if they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for one to speak in the church. What is probably going on here is that, let's say, okay, I am married, my husband's name is Stuart. Now, he is prophesying at church, and then he says something, and I go, dear, are you quite sure that's what you meant? Are you sure? What does that mean? I'm not following. Where does it say that in the Old Testament? And imagine this taking place all the time. So, I mean, anyone would go nuts if that's taking place. And because Paul very much ties this into prophecy and to the relationship of husband and wife, what seems to have been the case that Paul recognizes that, yes, okay, the girls, they should learn, but interrupting while your husband is prophesying is probably not the best time to be doing that, because it says here, for it is disgraceful. It would be quite nasty if while my husband is prophesying, I go up and say, well, excuse me, dear, but do you know what you're talking about?
I think every church has an experience of someone who won't shut up and keep interrupting.
So that would be quite disrespectful. So I think that's what Paul is saying here, because elsewhere in Corinthians and elsewhere in his letters, when he speaks about spiritual gifts, he doesn't say, oh, by the way, women, shut up now, don't listen to this, because you are not going to prophesy and you are not going to teach, nor are you going to lead. All the spiritual gifts of prophesying, encouragement, all the gifts of, like, say, apostleship or being a pastor, none of these are given any gender qualifications whatsoever.
Well, I suppose the obvious question that maybe comes out of that is, why is it not written that women are prophesying?
Oh, he actually does write about women prophesying.
Here we go.
He writes about this in 1 Corinthians 11. He writes about this, and he says, right at the end, where are we? A man ought to cover. Here we go, right at the start. Then now, in 1 Corinthians 11:3. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ. We can look at that in a minute. And the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, obviously, we're talking about something different here, but there is a blatant recognition that the women are praying and prophesying. So hence, when we read Paul's kind of instructions, we have to be aware of the larger context, what he says elsewhere, because if we take verses out of isolation, we can basically make it say heaven knows what. So we need to be aware of these other ones.
Well, because I think that's an absolutely brilliant thing. I mean, we talk about the idea of not prophesying, it's clearly there, but then there's the other part that's raised in that verse. You know, the man is the head of every woman.
Yeah, you are really poking the horn. Right, well, What I can say about this is that this whole argument, it's called the headship argument, and it is a slightly complicated one, purely because head in the ancient society, it looks like it probably meant something different than what it means now. So if I say that, I don't know, I am the head of Cliff College, that would mean probably that I'm the principal. I'm not, just to make that clear. I have not got our principal sacked. But that is what that would mean. But when we go into the ancient times, the Greek word for head is the word kephale. And when the word kephale is used in the Old Testament, and this would be now the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because the Old Testament originally it was written mostly in Hebrew, but when it was translated into Greek during a time when most Jewish people actually spoke Greek rather than Hebrew, when kephale is used there, it is hardly ever used in any context that implies like authority over someone.
Right.
A good example of this is actually in Judges 11, where there is a judge, Jephthah, who is quite an unhappy man in all sorts of ways, but he's just a good example of the use of this particular passage. And I'm actually digging this up for my notes, because believe it or not, I don't remember everything off by heart.
And yet you seem to know so much already.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm good like that. Yes, here we go. So basically, Israel is in trouble because some people have come, the Amorites, and are trying to overtake their land. So now the Israelites are in trouble. They need someone to lead them into battle. So the elders of the town turn up to this guy that they actually kicked out earlier called Jephthah, and they are asking him to go and lead them into battle. And what it says in Judges 11 and 8, it says that the elders of Gilead, that's the town where they lived, said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now," because they kicked him out earlier. "Come with us to fight the, not Amorites, Ammonites, and you will be head for all of us who live in Gilead." And the interesting thing about the use of kephale here is that in the Greek, I mean, my translation says it's head over, but that's not what it says. It's actually head for. So what it seems to be implying is that what they are asking Jephthah to do is not to all of a sudden build a mansion and be the lord of the manor, but they are asking him to be their representative. And what happens later in this story is that Jephthah actually goes back and forth with the Ammonite king representing the people, and when nothing comes out of that, then comes the attack. So if that kind of a use of the word kephale, the head, as being a representative is behind this, then 1 Corinthians 11 actually makes perfect sense, because in 1 Corinthians 11, when it talks about Christ and God and man and woman, we basically have this idea that, if I kind of take it down from the top, that the head of Christ is God. We get basically this idea that when Christ turned up on planet Earth, he was representing everything that God was and is and will be. So we get this idea even in John, where Jesus talks about the kind of, I only do what I see my Father do, and me and my Father are one. He is the perfect image of God. So in this sort of way, he is and was God's representative on planet Earth. And what we then get with the man, because he is then the head of the woman, well, in the society where Paul lived in, it was a patriarchal culture. In other words, the man of the house, so to speak, was in charge. So what he's saying, that actually now, in this world that you guys live in, the man, the husband, is going to be the woman's representative. Right. So because in this culture, what happened is that if, say, okay, I'll take Stuart and me as an example. If today I would go and come to Cliff College and paint all the walls pink, people would probably say, what the heck has she got into her head now? Kirsi, we need to have a chat. Why did you do that? In this culture, they would have looked at the guy and said, he can't control his wife. What's the matter with him? So basically what Paul is saying, that what is going on here is that because the woman, it later actually says that she is the glory of the man. She is representing back to him everything that she does. She can give him a good report or a bad report. And that is the idea here, is that when Paul is saying that the head of every man is Christ, well, if the husband does something wrong, that's going to represent badly on not the wife, but Christ. Because that's just how that ancient society worked. The men were God's representatives, whereas women were God's representatives as well. It doesn't say that the woman is the image of man. It just says the woman is the glory of man. She is reflecting back to him, either in a positive or a bad way. So when we read this entire thing through, it becomes fairly clear soon that what we are talking about are head coverings of some sort. That in that day and age, when people, probably a Roman custom, when they were roaming about, women who were modest and respectful would cover their heads. What the girls are doing, most likely here, is that they are coming to the church, and because church is met in homes, they are just flinging off their scarves. So they're like, oh, I'm at home, no one cares, I can just take it off. And Paul is like, actually, guys and girls, you both have somebody else's honor here to think about. Girls, be respectful towards your husbands, have your head covered as the custom is. Guys, be nice. You are, after all, reflecting back to Christ how he's going to be acting.
So when we get this image of actually women cover your heads, do that, it's more of a respect thing out of the way things are viewed at the time.
Yes, it is definitely a respect thing, and it's a similar sort of thing even now. I mean, if I walked up to my church wearing a bikini, it would not look very good to my husband. So it is a very much of a custom to do with the fact that you are respectful towards one another. One scholar even suggested that it might have been that only married women wore these headscarves, so maybe today's equivalent could be just wear a wedding ring. You don't have to have your head covered.
So the thing that really Paul's talking about here is actually very present even in today. This idea of respect, it's just the way that that's evolved through time.
Yeah, definitely. So this could still be applicable today. For example, by, I don't know, if you go down the wedding ring route, it could be that. Or it could be just the fact that in my dress and how I behave, I'll just make sure that I am not being disrespectful towards my husband. And I mean, in any Christian marriage or non-Christian marriage, you would want the spouses to respect one another. Absolutely. So it is just a matter of respect and making Christ look good.
Oh, which is always the aim. Well, if we look to a different practice, I'm wanting to get onto, I mean, you talk about context constantly. And I think we get to 1 Timothy 2:12, and it seems to be a very, fierce kind of, especially when you read of translations. In my translation, currently it says, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be silenced. I mean, I've read in other translations, it says, I will not suffer a woman to teach over a man. And you think, this is such a strong, where's the context in that situation?
Well, the context in this situation, again, is in part guesswork, because we are not there in Timothy's convocation, we are not in Ephesus, we can't know 100% certain. But a very good guess of what's going on in here can be gained from that little phrase that says to have authority. And this is the Hebrew word authenteo, and it's only ever used here in the New Testament.
Okay.
Now, people have gone through horrendous lengths to try to find out what that means, and some have said, oh, well, it means to have authority. Women, shut up! But actually, if you have a look at some of the other kind of texts that we have from the time period that are closest to Paul, the authenteo seems to mean something much more like to persuade someone or to exert influence over them. So what it seems that what Paul is talking about here is that in this church, if we look at 1 Timothy as a letter, about 33% of this letter is directed against false teachings and heresies. A lot of this letter, no other letter has that much stuff about false teachers and heresy. And there are times in this letter where Paul refers to, I am just picking up some of the passages, where Paul is referring to the women basically roaming from house to house and gossiping and basically saying things that they ought not. So yeah, we get the habit of, yes, here we go. We are in 1 Timothy 5. We have verse 13, besides these are women kind of wandering about, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, so on and so forth. Verse 15, some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. So this obviously is not gossiping about what your wife's pastor wore to church. This is something serious. So it seems that what Paul is basically saying here is that we have a problem in this church of false teachers. Most seem to have been men who then, Paul says elsewhere, gained entrance into gullible women's houses and are then spreading this doctrine that it looks like they are now spreading as well, going from house to house and making people fall from following God. So what Paul is doing is a bit of a drastic measure in a drastic situation, and he says, I do not permit a woman at this time, that would be kind of my addition there, to teach or to influence a man in a way that is not good.
So that then comes back to the idea of a lack of education for women at the time, really.
Yeah,
then being drawn, the more educated of the time, are being drawn away by gullible women, falling away from God, and Paul is saying, look, this is a serious situation, for now, stop.
Yeah, basically, because nowhere here does he say, and by the way, you must do this from now to eternity, or this is the rule in every church, or something like that. And in the where a similar command is being given, it's actually being given in the context so that the church won't fall into disrepute, so that things will look good to those outside. So it looks like Paul is basically saying, you know what, for heaven's sakes, he actually says in verse 11, a woman should learn. He's actually telling the women, actually, rather than teaching, go and learn. And this is a very direct command that should learn in English. It's very mild. It is actually, for heaven's sakes, make them learn. And it says, in quietness and full submission. You know, help them learn so that they can hopefully eventually teach. But for now,
And that in itself, in the context of, we're talking about the context of time, a little thing about women in that time would have been huge. So Paul saying go and learn, even in itself is massive at that time.
Women were not being educated at this point in time. There would have been no rabbi schools for women or something like that. So the fact that Paul is actually saying, for heaven's sakes, educate them, that is a huge thing on its own.
And you see this in the early church as well, actually. Even in the centuries following Christ, you see actually women were getting more of an education than of the other times. And this is, in your opinion, the effect of what's written in the scriptures.
Yes, that is the effect. And what we do then get is that we do then, at random times in the Bible, we do get women teachers, like Priscilla and Aquila. They were two married couple, most likely, Priscilla being a lady, and she is actually mentioned before her husband as giving some education to Apollos. So women obviously were starting to get onto that track, and some women had been able to get there, but this seems to be now a bigger command that no, it's not just for the select few, but, for heaven's sakes, teach them all. Please teach them all.
So if we then look at that, because we look at the history of the church, and we've talked through a lot of the verses that have been used when saying a lot of women shouldn't be allowed to be vicars or bishops or whatever it might be. And we've gone through a lot, and we've seen the context to it. So your argument would then be surely that, given the context of the time, we're vastly different today. Women are not viewed in the same way. No. Women do have far more equal opportunities than they did back then. And subsequently, that's kind of mild out. So women in leadership is actually a very natural thing, or at least a very godly thing.
I would say so. I mean, when we even look at just getting from Genesis to Revelation, I mean, once we get to Revelation, it is every nation, every tongue, everybody praising the Lord. So there is this kind of continuous of redemption, just God redeeming and fixing things from Genesis to Revelation. I think this is just a natural grow out. What's the phrase?
I'm lost, yeah.
But it's just a kind of outworking. That's what I'm thinking of. It is just a natural outworking of that. Bringing us back to Genesis, so to speak.
So in a sense, what we're trying to strive for, then, we mentioned this a bit earlier at the start, this Eden-like example, where Eve was a helper in a very godly sense almost to man, a necessity, and that both men and women are in God's plan a necessity to one another.
Oh, yes.
And that to trivialise that is not God's plan.
No, we are both needed, and we are both needed in our separate ways. And what I find interesting is that if you have a look at what men are in the Bible, what women are in the Bible, they have every possible role under the sky. So it's not like you as a man, well, because you're a man, your genes are telling you have to be a teacher. Me as a woman, I have the dishwasher gene, or something like that. They are all doing whatever God has called them to do, and that is why I think we should just stop doing this stereotyping and say, well, because you're a man, you should, or because you're a woman, you should, and let God call people to what they need to be doing, not what we think they should.
It's that idea again, if there is no Jew or Gentile in Christ.
Exactly.
But in Christ we are all quite equal in that sense.
Yes. Yeah.
So do you think there's a future changing? Because I think now we don't really have the same debate in the church, or at least as we did, as you say, about 50 years ago, about women being vicars or leaders. But in the Pentecostal churches especially, there is still, I mean, I'm very good friends with an Elim preacher, and in the Elim church, I think they've just started they've just started allowing women to be preached, but I don't think Assemblies of God and various other Pentecostal churches have yet made that change.
Yes, well, I mean, in a lot of movements, I mean, I come from a Pentecostal background myself, and from me being from Finland, it was quite curious because women in my kind of movement, they could be pastors, but they couldn't be elders, and there were all sorts of weird sort of qualifications who could do what. And I personally think that what we need to do here, as a couple of theologians have actually suggested, which is that when we look at the Bible, you know, we can throw Bible verses at each other from here to eternity if we like. I mean, I could make Bible say that we should still have slaves if I wanted to. What we need to be doing instead is to take the overall revelation of the Bible and follow that, because things taken out of context, we can always make them mean something. What I think would be more fruitful would be focusing on things like, what kind is a God that says, I have made a second-class citizen out of women? Or what kind of a God is a God who says, well, because you have breasts, you can't preach? What kind is a God who says, well, I made you black, so you have to be a slave? I don't think that's the God of the Old Testament. I don't think that's the God of the New Testament. It definitely ain't Jesus. So I think it's a bigger scale that we would need to take to this conversation rather than just individual verses.
And I think it's a very good point to make there, this idea of, I mean, I've heard this said a lot by people saying, actually, you can make the Bible say whatever you want. And I think it's quite true. You take a verse out, you can make it support almost anything. But in its broadest and most fullest sense, you can't. It gives a very direct message.
No, I think it has a very direct message, and I think it's time we started listening to that message a bit more. And obviously, in some circles, it's not so much of an issue. I have been to several churches where it still is, so it's definitely not out of date. But I think a way to move forward in that debate would be to listen to the larger message rather than just Bible bashing people.
So do you think the future of that then, if we look to the kind of that we've talked about, the Bible, the immediate tradition that seemed to go out of that, and even in the last 50 years talking about women in leadership, so is then the future of that then that people should be arming themselves with the context of the time, and that these other churches, these people are still holding on to these old ideas of women not being leaders, that we should arm ourselves with that kind of context, show that it is biblical, and hopefully in the future others will come around.
Yes, I would think so. I think teaching the context, teaching the overall revelation of the Bible, teaching even church history where, women are not as prominent, but God has called women to be prophets, apostles, missionaries, all sorts of things throughout church history. There is a definite stream going through all of this that is telling us who God really is, and it is not one that says you cannot because I made you second class. So I definitely think there is a future, and if Revelation is correct, we hopefully will get there.
Amen. Let's hope for that. So it's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for talking with us today about that. It's been amazing to look over some of those verses and see actually where it's going. Hopefully, I mean, I know that many of our church know you from Cliff Festival. No doubt maybe you'll get a following flocking to you now because of this interview.
Oh dear. Splendid. Well, thank you.